I buried my mother thinking grief would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The real shock came after the funeral when I found out she had left almost everything to the sister who vanished for years. I was the one who stayed, the one who drove her to doctors, paid attention, and held her life together when nobody else did. But somehow, I was the daughter she could afford to forget. What I uncovered next didn't just expose my sister. It changed everything I thought I knew about my mother. If you're watching, tell me where you're from or how this story hits you. And please like and subscribe so we can reach 1,000 subs and keep these stories coming. By the time the last car pulled away from the cemetery, my feet had gone numb inside my black pumps. It was a strange thing to notice after burying your mother. Not grief, not silence, not the raw cinematic devastation people expect from a daughter standing beside fresh dirt and wilting lilies. Just numb feet, a dull ache between my shoulders, and the faint smell of casserole dishes cooling in aluminum pans in the fellowship hall 2 blocks away. That was how the whole day had been. Small tasks stacked on top of each other so neatly there was no room left for anything dramatic. I had chosen the flowers 3 days earlier because the florist ran out of white roses and said she could get peonies by morning if I didn't mind paying extra. I had signed the final paperwork at the funeral home with a pen that skipped on the 3rd page. I had reminded Pastor Helen to leave out the part in the eulogy about my mother never complaining, because that would have been such a ridiculous lie, it might have made me laugh in the front pew. I had arranged the trays of finger sandwiches in the church kitchen. I had found extension cords for the coffee urns. I had taken Aunt Gloria's phone away from her when she tried to live stream the graveside service for a cousin in Tampa. I had done everything, which was not unusual. People looked at me all day with the calm confidence of people who had already decided I would handle things. Their expressions were soft, sympathetic, and grateful in the abstract. The kind of gratitude that costs nothing because it never asks what carrying all of it has done to you. Naomi will know where the guest book is. Naomi already called the funeral home. Naomi probably has the death certificates. Naomi, can you? Yes, I could. That had been the shape of my life for so long, it barely felt like a roll anymore. It felt like bone. The March wind had picked up by the time we got back to the church parking lot. Women pressed gloved hands to their hair. Men tugged at jackets that didn't quite fit across the stomach anymore. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that made every color around it look tired. I stood near the fellowship hall entrance with a paper cup of coffee gone lukewarm in my hand and watched people gather around my sister. Adrena had arrived the day before the service in a black wool coat with a narrow waist and clean silver buttons, the kind of coat that looked expensive without begging you to notice. She was 34, 4 years younger than me, and one of those women who had always understood light better than most people. It found her face and softened for her. Even grief seemed to sit prettily on her. Her eyes were red, but only at the edges. Her makeup hadn't survived untouched, but it had smudged in flattering places. She accepted condolences with both hands wrapped around the other person's fingers, head tilted just so, voice dropped low enough to sound intimate. Watching her was like watching someone remember an old language she hadn't spoken in years and still pronounce every word perfectly. "I just can't believe she's gone," she said to one of Mom's church friends, and it came out fragile and luminous, like something polished. People responded to her the way they always had. They leaned in. They forgave the years. They let absence become tragedy instead of pattern. There was a moment when Mrs. Bellamy from church touched Adrena's cheek and said, "At least you made it home in time, sweetheart." Home in time, as if grief were measured by arrival, as if the 8 years before that sentence had not existed. I looked down at my coffee and said nothing. Marlo noticed, of course. She always noticed. She crossed the parking lot toward me in dark tights and a camel coat, her auburn hair pulled into the kind of low knot that looked effortless until you tried it yourself and realized it was architecture. She owned the flower shop on Main Street, which meant she had delivered arrangements to our family for weddings, anniversaries, hospital rooms, and now a funeral. She moved through other people's milestones for a living and had somehow kept that from making her false. "You haven't eaten," she said quietly. I gave a tired laugh. "I had half a deviled egg in the kitchen." "That is not food." "It was if I chewed long enough." Her mouth twitched, but her eyes stayed on my face. Marlo never mistook competence for stability. That was one of the reasons I loved her. "You want me to stay longer?" she asked. I looked past her at the fellowship hall windows, fogged slightly from the heat inside. Shadows moved behind the glass, aluminum pans, folded tables. Women who would start packing leftovers into plastic containers before the coffee was cold. "No," I said, "I just need to get through another hour." Marlo touched my sleeve once. "That's not the same thing as being fine." "I know." And I did know. I just didn't have anywhere to put that knowledge yet. By 3:30, the casseroles had been praised, the pound cake had been wrapped, and the conversations had begun thinning into their true shapes. People stopped talking about my mother's kindness and started talking about logistics. Would we be selling the house? Was Adrena staying in town? Had my mother left instructions about the piano? Did I know where she kept the blue china? Questions floated toward me like lint in stale light. I answered what I could and sidestepped the rest. When I finally drove to my mother's house, the sun was already sinking behind the bare trees on Ashbury Lane. I still thought of it as my mother's house, even though I had spent more nights in my own apartment over the last few years, forcing some kind of boundary where none had existed before. But I had a key. I knew which cabinet held the extra light bulbs, which burner on the stove ran hot, which floorboard near the hall bathroom creaked in winter. I knew how the front lock stuck when it rained. I knew how long she liked her tea bag left in the mug. Knowledge like that rewires your body. It makes a place feel partly stored in your muscles. The porch light was already on when I pulled into the driveway. Adrena's rental car sat behind my sedan, glossy and dark beneath a layer of pollen. For one irrational second, irritation cut through everything else. Of course, she parked close enough to make it hard for me to back out later. I got out, walked up the front steps, and reached automatically into my purse for my key. The lock didn't turn. I frowned and tried again. Nothing. I looked at the key, then the knob, then the key again, as though metal itself might explain the betrayal. The front door opened before I knocked. Adrena stood there barefoot, one hand still on the knob. She had changed out of funeral black into cream-colored loungewear that looked softer than anything my mother had ever owned. Her gold hoops were back in. Her hair had been brushed smooth. For a second, the sight of her standing there so comfortably knocked the air out of me more than the locked door had. "Oh," she said, as if I had surprised her. "I was just coming to see if you were out here." I held up the key. "Why doesn't this work?" She glanced at it, then back at me. "Gideon suggested we secure the house." "We secure the house?" Her face stayed composed. "There are documents in here, Naomi. Jewelry, Mom's things. He thought it would be better if we had one updated set of locks until everything is organized." I stared at her. The words themselves were reasonable enough. That was what made them dangerous. There was always something especially infuriating about being pushed aside politely. "I needed Mom's medication list," I said, "and her appointment binder. Dr. Sethi's office is going to call this week." Adrena's expression softened into something I recognized instantly from childhood. Concern arranged for effect. "I already put all the medical paperwork together. I can bring you whatever you need." Bring me whatever you need. As if I were asking a favor in a house where I had spent the last 6 years refilling pill organizers and stripping bed sheets after night sweats. I stepped past her before she could say anything else. She didn't stop me, but I felt the shape of her displeasure behind my shoulder as I crossed the threshold. The house smelled wrong. Not bad, just wrong. Someone had lit one of my mother's expensive candles in the front room, the cedar one she only used at Christmas. The sweet, sharp scent floated over the lingering traces of old coffee, heating vents, and the lavender hand cream my mother rubbed into her wrists before bed. It felt like makeup on a body. Decorative. Too soon. I set my purse on the entry table and looked toward the kitchen. The legal pad my mother used for grocery lists was gone from the counter. So was the squat ceramic bowl where she tossed receipts and rubber bands. The small stack of unopened mail by the toaster had disappeared. A clean, empty space sat there instead, wide as accusation. "You've been going through things already?" I asked. Adrena leaned against the dining room archway, arms folded loosely. "Just the important stuff." My laugh came out sharper than I intended. "That's a fast turnaround. We buried her 2 hours ago." Her mouth tightened. "Some of us are trying to be practical." Some of us. I turned away before I said something unforgivable in the first chapter of Mourning. In the kitchen, I opened the drawer beside the fridge where my mother kept takeout menus, batteries, and the duplicate copies of every medication she'd ever been prescribed. Half of it was empty. In the den, the accordion file that used to live beside the recliner was gone. In the hallway, the little brass key that opened the lockbox in her bedroom desk had vanished from the ceramic dish near the mirror. By the time I came back to the living room, my pulse had started to climb. Where are her banking statements? Adrena's expression changed very slightly. "I consolidated the mail." "That's not what I asked." "They're with the rest of the paperwork." "Where?" "With Gideon." I just looked at her. Gideon Pike had handled estate planning for half the older people in town for as long as I could remember. He was in his 60s, trim and exact, with the kind of face that always looked recently shaved and a voice that never rose above what the room required. He had been my mother's attorney for years. I had met him twice, maybe 3 times, always in her driveway or at the grocery store, always briefly, enough to know he existed, never enough to be included. "Why would Gideon have her current statements?" I asked. Adrena gave the smallest shrug. "Because there are assets to review, Naomi. There are forms, beneficiaries. You know how these things work." "No," I thought. "I know how blood pressure cuffs work. I know how to coax an 82-year-old woman into swallowing pills when she's furious at the world. I know how to get red wine out of upholstery and when Mom was lying about chest pain because she didn't want to spend another night in the ER. But this had always been the room she kept locked inside herself." The sun had dropped lower and the front windows reflected us back in ghostly overlay. 2 daughters in black, one inside the house like she belonged there, the other still carrying her car keys and handbag as if she had only stopped in on the way to somewhere else. That was when something cold and hard began taking shape in my chest. Not clarity, not yet, just the first outline of it. The next morning, I sat across from Gideon Pike in his office on Main Street while he folded his hands over a yellow legal pad and explained with a measured voice and perfect posture that my mother had updated her estate plan 6 months ago, then 4 months ago, then again 9 weeks before she died. He slid copies toward us one by one, deeds, account designations, amendments, transfer documents. The house on Ashbury Lane would pass directly to Adrena. The investment account beneficiary had been changed to Adrena. A savings account I didn't even know existed had been converted into a joint account with right of survivorship, also with Adrena. A list of personal property, typed neatly and initialed, named specific jewelry pieces, furniture, and keepsakes. Again and again, the same name, Adrena Voss. My sister sat beside me in a pale blouse and a cashmere cardigan, one ankle crossed over the other, eyes lowered at exactly the right moments. She did not look triumphant. That would have been easier to fight. She looked sad, careful, burdened even, as if this had happened to her too. I kept waiting for my own name to appear somewhere meaningful. Not because I cared about the china or the silver, or even the house in the pure material sense people always assume, but because I needed some proof that the last 6 years had not been invisible inside my mother's mind. There were a few small bequests, my mother's wedding band, her recipe box, a cedar chest from the upstairs guest room, items that sounded sentimental enough to quiet an outsider and small enough to tell the truth. I heard Gideon still talking. Words like revised intent, updated distribution, non-probate transfer. None of them landed as hard as the silence around what wasn't there. No acknowledgement, no balance, no sign anywhere in those papers that the daughter who drove her to cardiology appointments and changed the batteries in her hearing aids and knew exactly how many stairs she could manage on a bad day had occupied any more space in her final decisions than the lamp by the sofa. I sat very still with my hands folded in my lap. It was not that my mother had forgotten me. That would have been kinder. She had remembered me well enough to leave me standing exactly where I had always been, close enough to carry her, far enough not to count. My apartment was too quiet in a way my mother's house had never been. Not peaceful, not restful, just quiet in the flat, exposed way a room feels after company leaves and you realize the air itself has changed. I stood inside the front door with my purse still on my shoulder and the recipe box Gideon had pushed across the table to me that morning, balanced in both hands, as if I had carried home the wrong life by mistake. The box was smaller than I remembered. Cherry wood, rubbed pale at the corners, a brass latch slightly crooked from years of use. My mother had kept it on the second shelf in the pantry, behind the canned soup and the jars of breadcrumbs she insisted on making herself. As a child, I used to think it held something more important than recipes, birth certificates maybe, or a secret amount of cash, or the kind of letters women in old movies tied up with ribbon and cried over in private. It had turned out to be index cards stained with butter and vanilla and gravy, all written in my mother's narrow, slanted hand. Now it sat on my kitchen counter under the yellow light, beside a grocery list I had forgotten to throw away 3 days ago. Eggs, dish soap, Mom's low-sodium crackers. I stared at that last line until my eyes blurred. For 6 years, maybe longer if I was being honest, my life had arranged itself around her needs so completely that even my own errands still carried her shape. I bought crackers she liked but never finished, herbal tea she claimed tasted like dust, pears that bruised before she remembered to eat them. I had entire aisles of the grocery store mapped according to my mother's appetites and aversions, and now there was no one left to buy for but myself, which should have felt simpler. Instead, it felt like standing in a room after furniture had been removed and discovering the carpet underneath was a different color. I set the recipe box down and took off my coat. On the back of one of my dining chairs hung the cardigan I kept at Mom's house because she always turned the thermostat down too low after dinner. My week-old mail was fanned across the table under a ceramic bowl. In the corner near the window sat the narrow basket where I tossed paperwork I meant to deal with later: insurance statements, drugstore receipts, appointment reminders, the kind of adult debris that multiplies when no one is looking. Half of it belonged to my mother. A cardiology follow-up from January. An explanation of benefits for a scan she complained about for 3 weeks. A pharmacy printout with her name, my address, and the dosage instructions I had rewritten in thicker marker because she said the original font was too small and designed by sadists. I should have thrown some of it away weeks ago, maybe months ago, but caregiving turns paper into a form of superstition. You keep things because discarding them feels like tempting disaster. I pulled out a chair and sat down without turning on any other lights. The estate documents from Gideon's office were still in my bag. I could feel them there the way you can feel a bruise through clothing, not touching it exactly, just knowing where it is. I didn't take them out. I didn't trust myself yet to look at Adrina's name appearing over and over in clean legal language without wanting to tear something that wasn't mine. Instead, I opened the recipe box. The top card was for pot roast. The next, lemon bars. Then baked ham with clove glaze, written on an older card with the edges curling inward. On the back of one in the corner, my mother had written, "Cut salt in half for Harold. Heart." I pressed my thumb over the word until it disappeared under my skin. People like to talk about grief as if it arrives in one pure form and stays there. But what sat with me that night wasn't grief exactly. It was insult, fatigue, humiliation, and something meaner than sadness. Not because I wanted the house, not because I cared who got the blue china or the investment accounts or the heavy dining table no one ever really used. It was because I had spent years learning her rhythm so thoroughly, I could tell from the sound of her footsteps whether she had remembered her morning pills. I could hear the difference between real chest pain and panic. I knew which stories from 1978 she repeated when she was lonely and which ones meant her blood sugar was dropping. And after all that, she had still found a way to make the official version of her life say Audrina. Not Naomi, who drove. Not Naomi, who stayed. Not Naomi, who knew where the emergency inhaler was when the power went out and Mom started breathing too fast in the dark. Just Audrina. I closed the recipe box and pushed it away. At some point, I must have been sitting there long enough for dusk to turn the windows black, because when the knock came at my door, the room flashed my own reflection back at me before I moved. It was Marlo. She stood in the hallway holding a white paper bag from Bell Street Deli and a 6-pack of ginger ale tucked against one hip. Out of funeral clothes, she had changed into dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that made her look younger and sharper at the same time. Her lipstick was gone. Her face looked tired in an honest way. "You weren't answering your phone," she said. "I left it in my purse." "That doesn't count as a reason." I stepped aside and let her in. She set the bag on the counter and looked around with the careful efficiency of someone taking inventory without making you feel examined. Marlo had always been beautiful, but not in a soft or decorative way. She looked like a woman who had learned to edit the world down to what mattered and had no patience left for frills. "I brought soup," she said, "and a sandwich. Eat whichever one makes you feel less insulted by the concept of food." "I'm not hungry." "I know. That's why I brought it myself." She moved around my kitchen like she'd done it before, which she had. Not often, but enough. 2 bowls, 2 spoons, the soup heating in a saucepan instead of the microwave, because Marlo believed certain acts of care should not be rushed, even if the person receiving them couldn't appreciate the distinction. I leaned against the counter and watched her. "You don't have to babysit me," I said. She glanced over her shoulder. "Good, because you would be a deeply annoying baby." Against my will, I smiled. That seemed to satisfy her. She turned the heat lower and said, "Talk." I let out a breath through my nose. "About what part?" "The part where you look like you're holding yourself together with office staples." I looked down at the counter. She left almost everything to Audrina. I gathered that. "No, I mean almost everything." Marlo nodded once. "Okay. The house, the investment account, a savings account I didn't even know existed, jewelry, furniture, half the room I grew up in, apparently." My laugh was thin. "And I got the recipe box, which feels so on the nose it would be funny if it weren't my actual life." Marlo stirred the soup. "You think people are going to assume this is about money?" "Yes." "Is it?" "No." She turned to face me then, spoon in hand. "What is it, Naomi?" I could have said betrayal. I could have said humiliation. I could have said that my mother had spent 6 years accepting my labor the way other people accept weather. Useful, unavoidable, not deserving of ceremony. Instead, I heard myself say, "I think the worst part is that none of it surprises me as much as it should." Marlo set the spoon down. There was no pity on her face, which was a relief. Pity always made me feel defensive, as if I had to perform being less hurt than I was to earn my dignity back. "She's been telling you who mattered for years," Marlo said gently. "This is just the first time it's in paperwork." I pressed my lips together, because she was right. It wasn't as though the favoritism had begun in a lawyer's office 6 months ago. It had been there in quieter forms for decades, dressed up as personality differences, family roles, practical necessity. Audrina was sensitive. I was capable. Audrina needed understanding. I needed to stop taking things so personally. Audrina was restless, creative, easily wounded. I was reliable, steady, good in a crisis. My mother had always said these things as compliments, or close enough to compliments to keep me from arguing. But over time, they hardened into a system. The more dependable I was, the less I was considered. The less Audrina offered, the more precious every fragment of effort became. I thought of one winter morning 3 years earlier when I had driven through sleet to pick up Mom's medication after my shift ran late. I walked in soaked to the knees, carrying 2 pharmacy bags and a gallon of milk, and she barely looked up from the den sofa before asking if I remembered to bring the good tissues instead of the cheap store brand. The next week, Audrina had called for 11 minutes from Santa Fe, all apologies and breathy affection and excuses about work. Afterward, Mom glowed like someone who'd been chosen. "She always did this thing," I said slowly, surprising myself with how much I wanted to say it aloud. "She'd act like I was stronger, so I needed less, as if being the one who could cope meant I should." Marlo slid a bowl toward me. "That's how families like this keep the engine running," she said. "They turn one daughter into a life raft and the other into a rescue fantasy." I looked up at her. "That is a horrifying sentence." "It is also an accurate sentence." I took a spoonful of soup, mostly to stop talking. Chicken, rice, too much pepper, perfect. The warmth settled in my stomach almost painfully. "She kept the money stuff separate from me," I said after a moment. "Always. If I asked about bills or accounts, she'd get offended, like I was trying to take over." "That tracks." She used to say, "I need help, not supervision." I stared into the bowl. "So I backed off, every time." "That also tracks." I hated how much relief there was in having someone else say that. Not because it excused anything, but because it made the pattern look real instead of imagined. I ate another spoonful, then another. Marlo opened the sandwich and split it without asking. "I found something tonight," I said. Her eyes lifted. "What?" I reached into the basket near the window and pulled out a crumpled stack of old receipts and medical paperwork I had shoved there months ago. Most of it was junk, copays, pharmacy slips, a receipt from a gas station off Route 8. But tucked between an imaging statement and a bill for compression socks was a folded invoice printed on thick cream paper. I smoothed it flat on the table. Marlo leaned in. The heading read, "Bluebird Mobile Notary Services" below that. A date from 4 months ago, an after-hours fee, 2 witness signatures, 1 home visit, service address, Ashbury Lane. Marlo looked at me. "You knew about this?" I shook my head. 4 months ago, that had been the week after my mother's medication was changed. The week she had called me twice, asking whether it was Tuesday when it was already Thursday. The week she'd insisted her dead sister had sent carnations and then gotten angry when I said Aunt Vivian had been gone since 2009. I touched the invoice again, more gently this time. It was not proof of anything by itself. I knew that, even in the moment. People signed legal documents at home all the time. Older people used mobile notaries all the time. Reasonable explanations existed, but this didn't feel reasonable. Not because it was dramatic, because it was quiet, because it had happened in the middle of ordinary caregiving days, tucked inside pharmacy runs and cardiology calls and soup containers in the fridge, while I was doing the visible work of keeping my mother alive and someone else was arranging the invisible work of what would happen after. I looked at the date one more time. Then I turned the invoice over as if the back might explain the front. It was blank. I did not go back to Gideon Pike's office because I believed he would suddenly become honest. I went because there is a particular kind of humiliation that becomes easier to carry once it has somewhere to stand. A receipt, a date, a name. Even if it doesn't prove what you want it to prove, it gives your mind a railing to hold on to. The Bluebird Mobile Notary invoice sat in a manila folder on the passenger seat beside me as I drove down Main Street the next morning. Caldwell was already awake in the gentle, repetitive way small towns are awake, delivery trucks idling behind the bakery, a man in a feed store cap sweeping the sidewalk in front of the hardware store, 2 women power walking past the post office in matching quilted vests as if they'd been born discussing blood pressure medication and city council rumors. I parked half a block from Gideon's office and sat there longer than I needed to. His building was narrow and brick-fronted, with gold lettering on the glass and a row of fake ficus trees inside the window that had looked dusty since 1998. It was the kind of office designed to reassure older people that serious things happened inside: estate planning, signatures, quiet money, the management of endings by appointment. I picked up the folder and went in. The receptionist looked up from behind a walnut desk. She was new to me, probably early 50s, with steel gray hair cut to the jaw and a silk scarf knotted too neatly to be accidental. Her nameplate said Janine Mercer, and she had the composed expression of someone who had spent years telling emotional people to take a seat and fill out a form. "Ms. Voss," she said, recognizing me faster than I expected. "Mr. Pike has a full calendar today. I only need 10 minutes. They all say that. I actually mean it. That earned me the smallest flicker of amusement. She asked me to wait, disappeared through a side door, then came back 2 minutes later and said, "He can spare 8. "Generous. Don't waste them." Gideon's office looked exactly the way it had yesterday, which I found offensive for reasons I couldn't have explained. The same legal pads, the same diplomas in dark wood frames, the same faint smell of paper, toner, and the peppermint lozenges he kept in a glass dish on the corner of his desk. He rose when I walked in. Not warmly, but correctly. "Ms. Voss." "Naomi is fine." He inclined his head. "Naomi." He remained standing until I sat, which somehow made the whole room feel more formal than if he'd stayed behind the desk. Gideon Pike was a narrow man in a charcoal suit that fit without wrinkling, the kind of man whose cufflinks looked inherited even if they weren't. His face had the smooth, managed quality of someone who had spent a lifetime never saying the wrong thing in public and very little of the right thing in private. I placed the invoice on his desk and slid it toward him. He glanced down. Not long, just long enough. Then he folded his hands. "Where did you get this?" "In my apartment, mixed in with my mother's medical paperwork." "That is not an answer to the question I meant." "I know." I leaned back. "What was notarized at my mother's house 4 months ago." Gideon did not touch the paper again. "I cannot discuss privileged communications with a former client." "She's dead." "Privilege survives death." That landed the way I expected it to. A wall. Smooth, lawful, difficult to hate because it had rules. "Fine," I said. "Then answer something else. Was she changing legal documents that day?" His gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with precision. "You're asking me for the substance of legal work. I'm asking whether my 82-year-old mother, who had been confused for part of that week, signed something significant in her living room while I was out picking up prescriptions." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Older clients often prefer mobile notarization. It is common. It is not in itself evidence of anything improper." "I didn't say improper. You were thinking it." "I'm thinking a lot of things." "That too is common." Under other circumstances, I might have admired him. Gideon had a way of keeping the room at exactly the temperature he wanted. No drama, no openings. Even his refusal came dressed like courtesy. I looked at the invoice again. "Did you have any concerns about her capacity?" "That did it. Not much. Just a slight stilling around the mouth. But enough." When he answered, his tone grew more careful, which was its own kind of answer. "Capacity is not measured by emotion, grief, or occasional confusion," he said. "It is measured by whether a person understands at the time of execution the nature of the document they're signing and the effect of signing it. So you evaluated that." "I follow appropriate procedure." "That's not the same sentence." His eyes met mine then. For the first time since I had known him, Gideon Pike looked faintly tired. "Naomi," he said, and my name in his voice sounded less like recognition than warning. "There is a difference between asking whether your mother loved you fairly and asking whether her documents are legally valid. Those are separate questions, no matter how badly you may want them to overlap." The words hit cleanly because they were true enough to bruise. I stood before I said something useless. Thank you for your 8 minutes. Naomi. I paused with my hand on the chair. If you believe you have grounds to challenge any of the instruments your mother executed, he said, you should retain independent counsel. Not don't, not you're wrong, just independent counsel. I looked at him more closely then, at the faint shadow under his eyes, at the way one of his fingertips pressed, once, against the edge of the desk before going still again. He was not helping me, but he was not entirely at peace either. I'm not asking whether she loved me fairly, I said. I know the answer to that already. Then I left. I drove from Gideon's office to the south end of town, where the older ranch houses gave way to duplexes and low apartment buildings with aluminum railings and plastic wreaths left up too long. Nora Bell lived in one of the duplexes on Linden Court, the kind with a narrow patch of grass out front and a ceramic frog by the steps that looked accidentally judgmental. I had her address because she had come to the house 3 times a week during the last few months of my mother's life. Technically, she was part of a rotating home health arrangement, but Nora had a way of making every room she entered feel less institutional and more factual. She wasn't warm in the performative sense. She was brisk, grounded, and impossible to manipulate with size. She opened the door in navy scrubs and thick white socks, a mug of coffee in one hand. She was in her late 40s, maybe 50, broad-shouldered, with brown skin and cropped hair that had gone silver at the temples. She had a face made for patience, but not softness, the kind of face people confess things to because lying in front of it seemed inefficient. Naomi, she said, I was wondering when I'd see you. That startled me. You were? She stepped aside. Come in. I just made coffee that tastes like bad decisions, but it's hot. Her living room was tidy without trying to impress anyone. A blanket folded sharply over one arm of the couch, a stack of nursing journals on the end table, a framed photo of 2 teenage boys in baseball uniforms beside a ceramic cross. Real life, arranged with competence. I sat at her kitchen table while she poured coffee into a heavy diner mug and placed it in front of me. I'm not here to put you in a bad position, I said. I need to understand something. Nora settled across from me. That's usually what people mean when they say they're not here to put me in a bad position. Despite myself, I smiled. Then I told her, not all of it, not the whole history of Audrina, the favoritism, the shape of my mother's emotional economy. Just the essentials, the revised estate documents, the notary invoice, the date. Nora listened without interrupting. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her mug and stared at the table for a moment. I can't tell you your mother lacked capacity, she said at last. That's not mine to say. And even if it were, it's not a switch that's either on or off the way people think. I know. She had good days, really good days sometimes. The week before Christmas, she corrected me on a dosage I'd written down wrong, and she was right. She remembered my son had twisted his ankle at regionals 2 weeks after I mentioned it once. Her mind wasn't gone. I nodded, though something in me tightened around the phrase, really good days. Nora continued. But she also had bad stretches, especially after medication changes. Fatigue, confusion, agitation. The oxygen issue didn't help. Neither did the anxiety. The week of this invoice? I slid the paper toward her. She put on reading glasses from the collar of her scrub top and looked at the date. Then she exhaled through her nose. That week wasn't her best. How bad? Nora chose her words carefully, and the care mattered more to me than certainty would have. She knew who you were. She knew she was at home. She could carry on a conversation. Nora tapped the invoice once, but there were periods where she lost track of time. She repeated herself. She got suspicious. Once she accused me of stealing a quilt that was draped over her own knees. That sounds like her, I said automatically. Nora's eyes lifted to mine. No, it sounded like your mother on a day when something was off. That distinction sat heavily between us. She was easy to redirect, I asked. Sometimes. Nora took off the glasses. Sometimes not. Depends who was doing the redirecting. I thought about Adrina's voice, light, soothing, coated in concern. My stomach turned. Nora saw something move across my face and said, "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm saying fluctuation is real. That's what you need to understand. People want clean categories, sharp enough or not sharp enough, competent or incompetent. Life doesn't behave that way, especially at the end." I looked down at the coffee. It had gone mostly cold. "Was Adrina there much?" Nora leaned back slightly. "More toward the end than before, at least from what I saw." "That's diplomatic. That's me being accurate." I waited. After a moment, Nora gave a small sigh. "Your sister was attentive when she was present. Very attentive. She asked about medications, asked about routines, wanted updates. Some family members do that because they care. Some do it because they're organizing themselves around a new reality. Sometimes it's both." There it was again, that refusal to overstate, which made everything she did say more powerful. I stood to leave 15 minutes later, feeling steadier and worse at the same time. At the door, Nora said, "Naomi." I turned. "I liked your mother," she said. "That doesn't mean she was easy, and it doesn't mean she was always fair. Sick people don't become saints just because other people are grieving them." I swallowed. "Thank you." She nodded once. "Get a good lawyer before you get a righteous one." That sounded like advice Nora had earned. By the time I got back to my car, the sky had shifted into that thin, late afternoon blue that makes everything look briefly cleaner than it is. I sat behind the wheel and opened the copy packet Gideon had given me the day before. This time, I looked more slowly, not at the assets, at the signatures, the witness blocks, the notary lines, dates, addresses. On one amendment, the witnesses were local, 2 names I vaguely recognized from Gideon's office. On another, the page listing execution formalities included a name I didn't know and an address I did not expect, the Hartwell Residences, a luxury apartment building near the river. Adrina had sublet a furnished place there when she first came back to Caldwell. She'd mentioned it once at the visitation, casual as weather, as if temporary riverfront living were as ordinary as buying toothpaste. I looked again at the witness line. Evan Sloat. Concierge. Not a longtime friend of my mother's. Not a neighbor. Not anyone from church. A concierge from the building where my sister had been staying. I stared at the page until the letters stopped feeling like letters and became something closer to choreography. Not proof. Not yet. But no longer coincidence either. And for the first time since the funeral, my hurt shifted shape. It was still hurt, but now it had edges. The first useful thing I learned about my sister had nothing to do with family. It came from the internet, which felt insulting in its own way. I was at my kitchen table with my laptop open, a legal pad beside me, and 3 different versions of Adrina's life spread across the screen like overlapping weather patterns. Old social media accounts, a dead business website, a LinkedIn page polished to the point of fiction, public records that didn't say much on their own, but said more once you laid them side by side and stopped expecting them to be neat. The story Adrina liked to tell was elegant. She had left Caldwell because she was meant for larger rooms, bigger work, better light. She had consulted in branding. She had done creative strategy. She had worked with boutique hospitality clients in Santa Fe, Phoenix, and Denver. There were photographs to support this version of her life. Courtyards with string lights, white wine on rooftop bars, hotel lobbies with too much marble, her face angled toward cameras as if she had been born halfway inside an advertisement. None of that was necessarily false. It just wasn't the whole thing. The old business site for Astor House Creative was still up if you knew where to look, though the contact form no longer worked and half the image links were broken. Arizona business records showed the LLC had been dissolved the year before. There was a civil filing in Maricopa County tied to a vendor dispute. Not a scandal exactly, but not nothing either. Then a notice connected to a residential lease, then a short trail of addresses that changed too fast for comfort. It looked less like reinvention than drift. I wrote down what I could: dates, cities, entity names, one property manager's office number. By noon, my coffee had gone cold, and my certainty had improved only slightly. Facts are disappointing that way. They rarely arrive with music. Marlo called while I was still staring at a cached page of Adrina's old website. "Well," she said without preamble. "Well, what?" "Either you found something or you're deep into online stalking with a level of concentration that worries me." I found enough to know her life wasn't as stable as she made it sound. Emotionally or financially? I looked at the legal pad. Financially leaves better fingerprints. That sounds promising. It sounds incomplete. Same thing sometimes. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed at the bridge of my nose. There was a dissolved LLC, a vendor dispute, a lease issue, nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest she didn't come back here because she suddenly missed homemade pot roast. Marlo was quiet for a beat. Then, "Do you know who might know more?" I did, or rather, I knew of someone who might. The name had come up twice in old posts connected to Astor House Creative and once in a tagged photo from a launch party in Phoenix. Tessa Rowe. She wasn't featured the way Adrina featured herself. She appeared in the margins, one arm visible handing over a tray of champagne flutes, a candid at a conference table, the kind of person who looked like she had actually done the work while someone else chose the lighting. "I may have a lead," I said. Marlo made a pleased noise. "Good. Eat lunch before you turn into a Victorian child." "I'm 38. "Then act like you know what protein is." She hung up before I could answer. I found Tessa's email on a portfolio site that looked current, practical, and untempted by adjectives. She handled event logistics and client operations for hospitality brands now, which tracked. Somebody had to have kept the lights on while Adrina was curating fonts. I wrote a message, deleted half of it, wrote it again. I kept it plain. My name is Naomi Voss. "I'm Adrina's sister. I know this is out of the blue, and I'm not asking you to step into family business. I'm trying to understand the timeline of her return to Caldwell and whether there were financial problems before she came back. If you're willing to speak, even briefly, I'd appreciate it." I expected no answer. Instead, 27 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a reply. "I'm not interested in getting dragged into anyone's drama, but if this is about money, you're asking the right question. I can do coffee at 4:30. Copper Finch, 1 hour. No greeting, no warmth." Somehow that made me trust her more. The Copper Finch sat on the edge of downtown in what used to be a dry cleaner. It served espresso in heavy ceramic cups and had exposed brick that looked too intentional to be called renovation. By the time I arrived, the late afternoon light was hitting the front windows at a slant that made every floating dust particle look expensive. Tessa was already there. She sat at a two-top near the back, one hand around an iced tea, the other resting on a closed notebook. She was probably mid-30s, though in a different way than Adrina, more worn in, less arranged, dark hair cut blunt at the shoulders, olive skin. No visible jewelry except a watch with a scratched face. She wore a black blazer over a gray t-shirt and had the kind of posture that suggested she had spent years around disorganized people and no longer mistook charisma for competence. When I reached the table, she stood halfway, enough to be polite. "Naomi?" "Yes." "Tessa." Her handshake was brief and dry. "I appreciate you meeting me," I said. "I almost didn't." She gestured toward the chair. "Sit." I sat. Up close, Tessa's face had that sharp stillness some women get after too much exposure to bullshit. Not bitterness exactly, just efficiency. A server came by and I ordered coffee I didn't really want. Tessa waited until he left before speaking. "I'm going to say this first so we don't waste time," she said. "I'm not here because I dislike your sister. I'm here because she has a talent for leaving a room, one version of events ahead of everybody else." That was such a precise description of Adrina that I felt a small, involuntary jolt of recognition. Tessa saw it. "Right," she said. "You know what I mean." "I do." She tapped one fingernail against the side of her glass. "Adrina is smart, charming, very good in the first half of things. First meeting, first concept, first impression, first apology. She can make people feel chosen. That goes a long way in branding, hospitality, fundraising, men, women, whatever room she's in. The problem is the second half. Follow through, budgets, commitments, actual consequences. My coffee arrived. I wrapped both hands around the mug but didn't drink. What was Astor House really? I asked. Tessa gave a short breath of something like laughter, a decent idea built on bad habits. We did pop-up event branding for boutique hotels and restaurant groups, small campaigns, launch dinners, visual identity, guest experience, press kits. For a while it worked, or looked like it worked. And then your sister started selling the future before she'd paid for the present. She said it matter-of-factly, not cruelly. Tessa opened the notebook, but did not slide it toward me. It seemed to function more as moral support than evidence. She overpromised deliverables, delayed payments to vendors, floated invoices, used incoming deposits to patch older holes. Not massive fraud, more like a person who keeps believing the next month will be the month everything smooths out. I thought about the version of Audrina who had floated into our mother's house with grief arranged around her face like silk. Was she in debt? Yes. How bad? Tessa tilted her head. That depends on whether you mean numbers or behavior. Both. Numerically, enough to keep someone awake. Behaviorally, bad enough that she was always looking for a bridge that didn't belong to her. The words sat between us, not because they were dramatic, because they felt earned. Tessa took a sip of tea. There was also a lease issue in Phoenix. She moved into a place she couldn't sustain. Then she tried to leverage a future contract that never came through. Then a vendor threatened legal action over unpaid design work and rush costs. Nothing that would make national news, but enough to make a person start scanning for exits. And then my mother got sick. And then, Tessa said, your sister started talking about family. It was such an ugly little sentence, I almost smiled. She said her mother needed her, Tessa continued. Maybe that was partly true. I'm not trying to flatten everything into a scam. People are complicated when money and family get in the same bed, but the timing was not subtle if you knew what you were looking at. I looked out the window for a moment. A couple in their 60s crossed the street holding iced coffees. A teenager on a bike cut too close to the curb and recovered at the last second. The whole town continued to behave as though my life had not split open in it. When she came back, I asked, did she plan to stay? Tessa considered that. I think she planned to secure options, she said. Staying was one of them. There it was again, that refusal to oversimplify. It made me trust her more than certainty would have. Did she ever mention my mother's assets? Not directly, Tessa paused, but she talked a lot about stability, about how some people had resources and didn't know how lucky they were, about how families should take care of their own when things got hard. My laugh came out lower than I meant it to. Convenient philosophy. She's very good at philosophies that arrive after the bill. That one landed too. I asked a few more questions. Dates, cities. Whether Audrina had ever mentioned any formal claim, any settlement, any bankruptcy. Tessa answered what she knew and said, I don't know, when she didn't, which in my experience is one of the most credible things a person can say. By the time we stood to leave, the sun had shifted, and the cafe had filled with the low end-of-day murmur of people pretending they weren't tired. Tessa tucked the notebook into her bag. For what it's worth, she said, I don't think your sister sees herself as a villain. That would be asking a lot of self-awareness. No. Tessa looked at me steadily. I think she sees herself as someone who's always one step from being abandoned, so she grabs before she's left empty-handed. I held her gaze. That hit closer than she knew, because it wasn't just Audrina. It was my mother, too. The thought came so quickly and completely that it almost felt like nausea. All this time I had been asking one question. How could she do this to me? Because it was the cleanest one, the most personal one, the easiest one to bleed from. But sitting across from a woman who had watched my sister build whole temporary lives out of need and presentation, I saw the old structure underneath ours, with a clarity that made my chest feel hollow. My mother had not given most of her life to Adrena because Adrena deserved it. She had given it because Adrena was the daughter who left, the daughter who might leave again, the daughter whose attention had always had to be purchased, coaxed, preserved, interpreted, forgiven. I had never terrified my mother in that way. I had been dependable enough to become background. The realization did not make anything better. If anything, it made the whole thing crueler, because it meant I had not been overlooked by accident. I had been discounted by design, not malicious design maybe, but a lifetime of emotional math that always arrived at the same answer. You can take more. You will stay. You are safe to disappoint. I thanked Tessa and stepped out into the cooling air with my purse heavier than when I'd arrived, even though there was nothing new inside it. The drive back took me past Ashbury Lane. I had not planned to turn there. My hands did it before my mind caught up. My mother's house sat at the far bend, where the road narrowed and the older oaks leaned in toward one another like women sharing bad news. The porch light was off. The front curtains were drawn. Adrena's rental car was gone. For a moment, I just sat at the curb with the engine idling. I could still picture my mother in that front room years before she got sick enough to need help with almost everything. Perfect lipstick, one leg crossed, a wine glass in hand, waiting for Adrena to call and pretending she wasn't. If Adrena did call, the whole house lifted. If she didn't, my mother became brittle by evening, tender 1 minute, and cutting the next, as if disappointment had to go somewhere and I was the only available surface. I had mistaken that pattern for personality for years, maybe because children will call almost anything normal if it keeps the walls standing. There was a soft knock on my passenger window. I startled so hard my elbow hit the console. It was Evelyn Mercer from next door. She stood on the sidewalk in a pale blue cardigan and sensible sneakers, one hand lifted in apology. Evelyn had lived beside my mother for over 20 years and somehow always looked as if she had just come in from watering something. She was in her 70s, small-framed, with soft white hair and a face lined by equal parts kindness and weather. She had the unshowy steadiness of women who never announce what they've witnessed, but miss very little. I rolled down the window. "Lord, I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to scare you." "It's okay." I put the car in park. "I was just..." She glanced at the house and spared me the indignity of finishing the sentence. "I thought that was you," she said. Then, after a small hesitation, "Would you step out a minute, honey?" I did. The evening had turned cooler than I expected. Somewhere farther down the block, someone was grilling, and the smell of char and lighter fluid drifted between the houses. Evelyn stood close enough that I could see she was holding something flat against her side. "I've been meaning to catch you," she said. "What is it?" Her mouth tightened, not with disapproval, but with the effort of deciding how much to say. "A few months back, your mother brought something over to me." She lifted the item in her hand, a large cream-colored envelope sealed. "She asked me to keep it, said if, after everything, things turned ugly, I was to give it to you." My breath stalled. "After everything?" I repeated. Evelyn nodded once. That was her wording. I looked at the envelope. My name was written across the front in my mother's hand. Not typed, not formal. Just Naomi, in blue ink, slightly slanted, the way she wrote grocery lists and church checks and birthday cards she mailed a day late. I did not take it right away. Evelyn watched me for a moment, then put a gentle hand against my forearm. "I don't know what's in it," she said, and I didn't ask. But your mother was not a woman who handed over control easily. If she gave something away before she died, she meant for it to matter. That was the kind of sentence that could crack a person open if it arrived at the wrong angle. I reached for the envelope. It was heavier than paper alone should have been. I did not open the envelope in my car. That probably sounds like restraint. It wasn't. It was fear with better manners. I drove home with it on the passenger seat, face up, my name visible every time I stopped at a light. The paper was thick enough to hold its shape, the kind sold in stationery stores that still believe in morning notes and fountain pens. My mother had always liked materials that implied seriousness, heavy drapes, real silver, thick envelopes, things designed to suggest that whatever they contained mattered before you even knew what it was. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, it was fully dark. I carried the envelope upstairs with both hands as if it might spill if tilted. Inside my kitchen, I set it on the table and stood looking at it while the refrigerator hummed and a car alarm chirped twice somewhere outside and stopped. The room was ordinary in all the ways I suddenly couldn't bear. My cardigan over the chair, the dish towel looped over the oven handle, a half-empty bottle of olive oil by the stove. Meanwhile, my mother's handwriting sat 6 feet away like it had crossed over from a different climate entirely. Naomi, no dear, no last name, no performance of affection, just my name, as if that were enough to steady whatever had been put inside. I washed my hands before I opened it. Again, not because I was composed, because I needed one more minute in which nothing changed. The flap had been sealed carefully, not licked shut in haste, but closed with deliberate pressure. When I eased a butter knife beneath it, the paper gave way with a soft tear that sounded much too loud in the room. Inside were 3 things: a small USB drive, a packet of folded pages held together with a paper clip, and 1 narrow spiral notebook, the cheap pharmacy kind my mother used for grocery lists, blood pressure numbers, phone messages, and the small practical records that used to anchor her days. I stared at all 3 for several seconds without touching them. Then I picked up the pages first. They were not a letter in the way I had half feared, half expected. Not a sweeping confession, not a last-minute apology dressed in sentiment. Just 4 pages written in my mother's hand, uneven in places, firmer in others, as if they had been written across more than one sitting. The first line was enough to make my throat close. If you are reading this, then things have gone the way I was afraid they might. I sat down, not because my knees gave out. That would have been dramatic, and my life rarely allowed me the dignity of dramatic collapse. I sat because my body recognized before my mind did that standing would make the words harder to survive. I read slowly. My mother did not say I was right. She did not say she had been cruel. She did not use the kind of language that would have made healing easier. Instead, she circled the truth the way she had always circled anything shameful, with control, with hedging, with just enough honesty to injure and not enough to redeem. She wrote that she knew there might be confusion after her death. She wrote that she had made arrangements she believed were necessary. She wrote that Audrina had needed stability. Then, halfway down the second page, she finally stepped over the line she had been edging toward since the first sentence. You have always been the one I never had to worry would leave. I stopped reading. Not because it surprised me, because seeing it in ink made it smaller and uglier than I had ever allowed it to be inside my own head. The sentence sat there without apology. Not, you were dependable. Not, I trusted you. Not even the flattering version of the wound. Just the bare structure of it. I never had to worry you'd leave, which meant by implication that what had been done to me was not a misunderstanding. It was a consequence of being the child who remained available. I looked away from the page and let my eyes rest on the dark window above the sink. For years, whenever anyone praised my good heart, I had accepted it the way women in towns like mine are trained to accept certain burdens. Quietly, with a nod, as if there were virtue in being easiest to use. You stay. You absorb. You don't make your steadiness expensive for other people. And there it was, in my mother's handwriting, the bill. I kept reading. There were fragments that felt almost like tenderness, which somehow made them harder. She wrote that I had carried more than I should have had to. She wrote that I was stronger than was fair. She wrote that she knew Adrena had always wanted what looked solid, and that sometimes she could not tell whether that was fear, hunger, or selfishness. Then came the sentence that split the page open. I know she often comes close only when she needs something. I also know she has spent her whole life making me afraid to lose her again. I pressed my fingers against my eyes until color sparked behind them. There it was. Not a misunderstanding, not blindness, not the sweet fiction that mothers do their best and simply miss the harm. She had known. Maybe not everything, maybe not every motive, but enough. Enough to name it privately while still arranging the world to reward it. The last page was shorter, shakier. If there is trouble, look at the notebook. No explanation. No, I'm sorry. No request for forgiveness. Just another task. A part of me nearly laughed at that. Even from beyond the grave, my mother had apparently found a way to hand me a problem and call it communication. I set the pages down and pulled the spiral notebook closer. It was smaller than my palm, the cover bent at one corner, the metal coil slightly warped. On the first page, she had written expenses in block letters, underlined twice. The entries were not diary-like. They were practical, clipped, transactional, dates, amounts, account initials, sometimes a note in the margin. At first glance, it looked dull enough to make my pulse drop. Grocery reimbursements, utility figures, pharmacy copays, a furniture delivery, insurance drafts. Then I reached the section from the last 6 months. That was where the pattern shifted. There were withdrawals from the joint savings account I had learned about at Gideon's office. Not one large dramatic transfer. Smaller amounts. Repeated. Irregular enough to avoid standing out if you weren't tracking them. Frequent enough to matter if you were. $1,200, transfer $850, cash withdrawal $2,100, temporary $600, card payment $1,475, repay later. The notes beside them were maddeningly brief. A said deposit issue for apartment hold bridge until check clears, do not mention to N. I read that last one twice, then a third time. Do not mention to N. Not because I had been wrong about them keeping things from me. Because I had been right in such a banal, almost administrative way, hidden not with fireworks or screaming betrayal, but with margin notes and shorthand. Domestic conspiracy, written like budgeting. I turned more pages. Near the back, the handwriting changed again, sloppier, larger, as if written when her hand was unsteady or her patience thin. There were entries from the weeks around the mobile notary invoice. Too tired today. A came by with papers, said just signatures. Need to ask G again what is where. N upset lately. Cannot deal with both. A says this will simplify things. I sat perfectly still. The phrasing mattered. Not because it proved coercion by itself. It didn't. I knew enough already not to turn discomfort into certainty too quickly. But A came by with papers was not the language of a woman serenely and independently directing her own estate strategy. It was the language of someone tired, someone behind her own paperwork, someone relying on a story she was being told about. What would be easier? I reached for the USB drive next. My laptop took too long to recognize it, long enough that I almost changed my mind. There was only one file on it, an audio recording labeled March 14th, the day before my mother died? No. I caught myself. The date format belonged to months earlier. March had been when the funeral happened. This recording was from the year before. I clicked play. At first, all I heard was fabric movement and the distant hum of television. Then my mother's voice, thinner than I was used to hearing it, as though it were coming through from the bottom of a hallway. I'm recording this because sometimes I lose my thought, she said. I closed my eyes. Her breathing was audible between sentences. Not labored exactly, measured, deliberate. The breathing of someone conserving energy because there may not be enough later. She spoke about practical things first. Blood pressure. The house. Whether the church had the extra key. She mentioned my father once, dismissively. Then, without transition, her voice changed. Not softer, but less guarded. Naomi will do what needs doing, she said. She always has. The old reflex in me, the one still trained to hear that as praise, twitched and died before it could fully rise. Then came the line that made me grip the edge of the table. I know what that has cost her. Silence. A cough. The television murmur shifted in the background. Then, Adrena only comes close when she's afraid, or when she wants something. Maybe those are the same. I opened my eyes and stared at the laptop screen, as if sound could be made visible if I looked hard enough. My mother went quiet for several seconds after that. I thought the recording had ended. Then she spoke again, and her voice had that strange flatness people get when they are telling the truth to a room instead of to another person. I keep thinking if I put enough under her feet, she'll stop floating. Her, not you girls, not the children. Adrena. I listened to the rest without moving. There was no master revelation at the end, no sentence that would solve everything or spare me the parts that still hurt too much to name. She did not retract what she had done. She did not say she had chosen wrongly in full. She did not choose me at the last moment in some neat, redemptive way. What she did do, worse, perhaps, was confirm that she understood more than I had ever let myself believe. She knew I carried the dependable weight. She knew Adrena's attention sharpened around need. She knew she was trying to buy something that had never stayed bought before. When the recording ended, the kitchen felt smaller. I sat there for a long time with my hands flat on the table, looking at the notebook, the pages, the USB, the whole miserable little archive of partial truth. This was not the miracle version of events some bruised corner of me had apparently still been waiting for. It was not evidence that my mother had secretly meant to make things right. It was not a hidden amendment naming me sole heir, not a confession clean enough to hand a judge, not the kind of emotional clarity people invent when they want love to be simpler than it is. What it was worse and more useful. My mother had known. Not everything. Not with perfect language or moral courage or the ability to stop herself. But she had known enough to see the shape of the damage as she made it. And in the notebook, beneath the ache of that truth, was something else. Those entries, those scattered notes, those repeated temporary withdrawals and just signatures days that suggested her favoritism had not stayed in the realm of feeling. It had moved into transactions, into access, into quiet money. I picked up the first handwritten page again and read the opening sentence one more time. If you are reading this, then things have gone the way I was afraid they might. For the first time since the funeral, I understood what things might mean. Not grief, not inheritance, exposure. My mother had not left me an apology. She had left me a record of what she was too weak or too unwilling to stop. And that, for the moment, was more dangerous. By Monday morning, I had stopped asking myself whether I was overreacting. That phase had been useful for exactly one thing, delaying action long enough for everyone else's version of events to start hardening in public. By then, the town had already begun doing what small towns do best, not investigating, arranging, taking a messy human situation and folding it into a shape that could be repeated over coffee, over prayer chains, over deli counters and front pews. I could feel it happening around me even before anyone said anything directly. At the pharmacy, a woman I had known since high school gave me a sympathetic look that lasted half a second too long. At Bell Street Deli, the cashier called me sweetheart in the careful tone people use when they suspect you are becoming the difficult relative in a story they have only heard from the other side. No one asked me outright whether I was contesting my mother's estate. No one had to. That was the beauty of a place like Caldwell. Reputation moved faster than facts and wore better shoes. I spent most of Monday morning at my kitchen table with my mother's notebook open beside Gideon's copies and the Bluebird mobile notary invoice laid flat beneath a glass candle holder so the paper wouldn't curl. The materials no longer felt like grief objects. They had shifted categories. Still painful, still personal, but now also functional. a date, a witness, a pattern of withdrawals, a tired woman's shorthand, the beginning of something that might matter outside my body. The question was, what to do with it? Nora's voice came back to me. Get a good lawyer before you get a righteous one. I called 3 firms before lunch. The first had a receptionist who spoke in the slow, exhausted cadence of someone who had spent 20 years scheduling arguments for wealthy siblings. The second specialized in real estate and light probate administration, which sounded like exactly the wrong temperament for what I had. The third transferred me twice, put me on hold long enough for me to decide I hated everyone involved, and then connected me to Calder and Wren, probate litigation. That was how I met Rhea Calder. Her assistant offered me a consultation the next afternoon in a nearby city about 40 minutes from Caldwell. When I asked whether she handled undue influence and capacity disputes, the assistant said, "That's most of what she handles," in a tone that suggested Ms. Calder did not lose sleep over family disappointment. Good, I thought. One of us should get the day off. The drive to Rhea's office took me west through a strip of chain stores, dentist buildings, and new subdivisions with names like Willow Trace and Stone Hollow, neither of which contained what they promised. Her office was on the 4th floor of a glass-fronted building above a physical therapy clinic and a financial planner whose sign featured a sailboat no one in this county had ever owned. The waiting room was clean in a way that didn't try too hard. No inspirational quotes, no bowls of peppermints, just 2 low chairs, legal magazines no one read voluntarily, and a receptionist in tortoiseshell glasses who moved with efficient indifference. When Rhea Calder stepped into the doorway and called my name, I understood immediately why Nora had recommended someone like her without ever naming her. She was maybe mid-40s, tall in a narrow way that made suits look architectural on her, with dark hair pinned back loosely enough to suggest she did not regard her own appearance as a public service. Her face was not soft, but it was alive in a very specific way, watchful, unsentimental, impossible to flatter by accident. She wore a navy jacket over a white blouse with the sleeves pushed once at the wrist, and when she shook my hand, her grip was cool and brief. "Naomi Voss," she said. "Come in." Her office had windows on 2 sides and no decorative nonsense, a legal desk. 2 chairs, 1 potted plant doing better than I expected, file boxes against the wall. The whole room felt designed for a single purpose, separating useful truth from expensive emotion. "Before we start," she said, sitting across from me, "tell me what outcome you think you want. Not the one that sounds best, the real one." There it was, no softening, no ritual sympathy. I almost loved her on the spot. "I don't know yet," I said. "Then start with what you don't want." I looked down at my folder. "I don't want to spend 6 months and $15,000 trying to prove my mother didn't love me enough." "That's good," Rhea said, "because courts are terrible at that." A reluctant smile tugged at my mouth. She leaned back slightly. "Now try again." I took a breath. My mother revised her estate plan several times in the last 6 months of her life. Most of the significant assets shifted to my younger sister. I was her primary caregiver for years. I found records suggesting my sister had access to a joint account and was taking money from it in smaller, repeated amounts. I also found notes from my mother indicating she was tired, confused, and signing things because my sister told her it would simplify matters. There was a mobile notary involved during a week when a nurse told me my mother was having cognitive fluctuation. One of the witnesses on one document is the concierge at the building where my sister was staying. Rhea did not interrupt once. When I finished, she held out her hand. "Show me." I gave her everything. Not the original envelope, but copies of the handwritten pages, photos of the notebook entries, the notary invoice, the estate documents Gideon had provided, and a typed summary of dates I had put together the night before, because panic makes some people cry and others build timelines in 12-point font. She read for a long time, long enough that the silence between us stopped feeling like tension and started feeling like work. At one point, she circled a date on the notary invoice. At another, she marked one of the A came by with papers entries with her pen cap. She asked me 3 questions in quick succession. "Your mother's full medical providers?" Who drafted the original estate plan? Did your sister ever have formal power of attorney? The answer to the last one was no, not that I knew of. That matters, Rhea said. Is this enough? I asked. For what? To challenge it. Rhea looked up. This is enough, she said carefully, to justify asking harder questions. That should not have sounded as comforting as it did. She turned one of the copied pages toward me, the line where my mother had written, "Do not mention to N." People think estate litigation turns on dramatic revelations, she said. It usually turns on patterns, timing, access, dependency, who was in the room, who benefited, what the decedent's condition was on the specific dates documents were executed. We are not trying to prove your mother was a different woman than she was. We are trying to determine whether some of these transactions reflect her actual independent intent. The distinction settled something in me, not because it hurt less, because it hurt more precisely. Rhea opened a yellow legal pad and drew a line down the center. Left side, she said, we build a medical timeline. Hospitalization, medication changes, oxygen issues, nursing notes, any confusion, any documented cognition concerns. Right side, we build a document timeline. Amendments, beneficiary changes, transfers, notary dates, witness identities, withdrawals. Then we see where they overlap. She started writing. I watched the structure appear under her hand and felt for the first time since the funeral that my mother's last months might be translated into something other than private ache, not redeemed, not repaired, just translated. Rhea's voice remained even. You need to understand something before you go any further. Contesting a will is one thing. Challenging non-probate transfers, amendments, and beneficiary designations is another. Some of this may stand, some may not. Your mother may have been fully competent on one date and not on another. She may also have made unfair choices while entirely competent. The law does not protect adult children from disappointing parents. I know. Do you? There was no cruelty in it, just professional impatience with self-deception. I thought about the audio recording, about my mother saying she knew what my reliability had cost me, about her still choosing as she did. Yes, I said after a moment, I think I do. Rhea nodded once, satisfied enough to continue. I'm not interested in helping you rewrite your mother into a saint who was tricked by villains, she said. And I'm equally uninterested in letting opportunistic people hide behind grief and paperwork. If we move forward, we do it on facts. That's what I want. Good, because facts are expensive and feelings are free. Most clients prefer the reverse. That almost made me laugh. Almost. When the meeting ended, she gave me a short list. Authorize medical record requests. Preserve every text, voicemail, email, and document. Do not confront Audrina in writing. Do not discuss litigation strategy with anyone in town who enjoys casseroles and loose language. Is that legal advice? I asked. That's survival advice. Back in Caldwell, the social temperature had shifted another degree by the time I got home. I found the first real sign of it not in a legal notice or an angry voicemail, but on Facebook. A woman from church, someone who had once complimented my lemon bars at a potluck and forgotten my birthday every year since, had shared one of Audrina's old photos from the funeral. Black coat, downcast eyes, caption about family being complicated in grief. The comments beneath it did what comments do. Praying for peace. No one should have to deal with this right after losing their mama. Money brings out the worst in people. There it was. No names, no facts, just a public mood, carefully set. My phone buzzed with a text from Marlo before I could decide whether to throw it or laugh. Don't read the comments. Also, your sister was at Hargrove's acting like she just finished a hostage negotiation. I called her. She's talking? I asked. Marlo snorted softly. She's not exactly issuing a press release, but she's doing that thing where she sounds exhausted and gracious in public and lets other people reach the conclusion for her. Which conclusion? That you're making a difficult time harder. Of course. There was almost something comforting in how predictable it was. What did you say? That I was buying tulips, not tickets to a performance. I sat on the edge of my couch and closed my eyes. This is going to get ugly, I said. It may already be ugly. I haven't even filed anything. Marlowe's silence lasted half a second. That's not when stories start, Naomi. That's when paperwork catches up. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen and looked around at the little life I had built in the margins of caregiving. The dishes drying in the rack, my own coat on the hook, the lamp I bought myself 2 birthdays ago because no one else remembered I needed one. Then I opened the folder again and started building the timeline Rhea wanted. March 14th, audio recording, June 3rd, medication adjustment. June 7th, oxygen drop, home health note. June 9th, Bluebird mobile notary. June 12th, A came by with papers. July 1st, joint account withdrawal. The work steadied me in a way nothing else had. Not because it erased what hurt, because it gave the hurt edges and sequence and names. By Thursday, Rhea's office had sent formal requests for records. By Friday, she had drafted initial letters preserving claims and seeking account documentation. And by the following Tuesday, for reasons that were never fully explained to me, but felt entirely in character for the universe, I received a message from her that said, "We'll likely need document production from Gideon Pike. He won't volunteer much, but he doesn't have to volunteer if he can be required." 3 days later, I was back in her office looking at a stack of indexed materials her paralegal had assembled from what had already started coming in. Not privileged legal advice, not the inside of my mother's confidential conversations, administrative communications, scheduling messages, execution records, witness coordination, enough to show shape. Rhea slid 1 page toward me, an email chain. One message from Adrena asking whether everything could be moved sooner because she couldn't afford to have this drag into the fall. Another, shorter one, sent 2 days before a signing date. She's tired, but mornings are better. If we can keep it simple, she'll do it. My stomach dropped, not because it proved everything, because it proved enough. Enough to show that my sister had not been a passive recipient of my mother's late life decisions. She had been managing the logistics around them. Rhea let me read the page once, then again. When I looked up, she was watching me with the same unsentimental steadiness she had offered from the beginning. "This," she said, tapping the email lightly, "is why you hire lawyers instead of cousins with opinions." I almost smiled. Then the smile disappeared just as quickly because beneath the vindication was something harder, a question that had been circling me for days and had finally grown too loud to ignore. What if some of it really was what my mother wanted? I asked. What if I do all this and I'm still just fighting the truth? Rhea did not answer immediately. She folded her hands once, then said, "You are not entitled to a different mother than the one you had." The sentence landed so cleanly it felt surgical. She went on, "But you are entitled to a clear record of what happened. Those are not the same thing." I looked down at the timeline between us, at my mother's fatigue, my sister's urgency, Gideon's procedure, the money, the witnesses, the notebook, the dates, all of it. Not a fairy tale, not a total fraud, not an innocent misunderstanding, just a family finally forced into the language of evidence. The settlement conference was scheduled for a Thursday in late October, which felt like the kind of detail my mother would have appreciated. She had always believed difficult things should happen on weekdays, in proper shoes, under fluorescent lighting. No scenes, no raised voices, no grief dramatic enough to wrinkle upholstery. By then, the leaves in Caldwell had gone brittle at the edges. The oaks along Ashbury Lane looked singed gold, and every gust of wind seemed determined to strip the town down to what would survive winter. I had been living inside paperwork for months. Affidavits, records, production requests, summaries from Rhea's office that translated my mother's last year into columns and sequences and dates with brackets around them. The more we built, the less the case resembled a family tragedy, and the more it resembled what it actually was, a series of choices made by specific people under specific conditions, some lawful, some questionable, none of them innocent just because they had been made quietly. The conference took place in a low government building in the next county, in a room with a fake ficus in one corner and a coffee machine that produced something the color of rust. I had expected to feel theatrical when I saw Adrena again across a table. I didn't. Mostly I felt tired. She looked thinner than she had at the funeral, not fragile, sharper. Her face had lost some of its softness, the way certain women look when their mirrors stop agreeing with them. She wore cream again. Adrena had always favored colors that implied innocence without risking purity, and sat beside her attorney with one ankle crossed over the other, chin lifted just enough to look controlled. Gideon was not there. That made sense. He had become less a man than a weather system by that point, present everywhere in effect, nowhere in loyalty. Rhea sat beside me in navy, a legal pad angled toward her like a weapon she did not need to lift. She had the same still, precise energy she always carried into rooms where other people wanted feelings to count as facts. I was grateful for her in a way I had stopped trying to phrase elegantly. The mediator, a broad man in his 60s, with a face pinked by years of courthouse air and cafeteria coffee, gave the standard opening remarks in the tone of someone who had watched too many siblings mistake righteousness for strategy. We did not go to trial. That is not the same thing as saying it was easy. By then, the shape of the case had become clear enough to make certainty impossible for everyone. Some documents had been executed during periods where my mother appeared sufficiently oriented, and the record supported that. Some decisions were cruel, but legally durable. There was no courtroom miracle waiting to restore me to some imaginary rightful place inside her heart. But there were also the other things, the timing, the email coordination, the witness choices, the repeated withdrawals, the notebook entries, the evidence that at least some transfers and late-stage changes had happened in a climate of fatigue, dependence, and pressure murkier than anyone on Adrena's side had hoped. What emerged was not justice in the cinematic sense. No judge struck a gavel and declared me vindicated. No one publicly admitted I had been carrying a family on my back while they called it character. Instead, there was negotiation. Unromantic, expensive, clarifying negotiation. Some of the late-stage financial transfers were unwound and returned to the estate for proper administration. Certain transactions tied to the joint account were recharacterized and pulled back into review. A few of the more questionable changes made during my mother's weakest periods did not survive scrutiny, but some things stayed. That was the part no one in stories likes to talk about. The house did not come back to me as a moral reward. A portion of the investment structure remained exactly as my mother had signed it months earlier, because the evidence suggested that on at least some of those days, she had understood enough, wanted enough, chosen enough. Not wisely, not fairly, but really. I had to sit there and absorb that without flinching. Rhea had warned me, of course. You are not entitled to a different mother than the one you had. It turned out she had been right in ways that hurt more at the end than at the beginning. After 6 hours, 3 caucuses, and 1 break in which I stood in a cinder block hallway eating salted almonds from a vending machine like a woman on the verge of either maturity or arson, the broad terms were done. The house on Ashbury Lane would be sold. Not because I wanted to erase it, not because Adrena volunteered anything noble, because by the time the dust settled, sale was the cleanest legal answer to a property that had become too burdened by dispute to remain anyone's sanctuary. The proceeds would be distributed according to the restructured outcome, some obligations paid first, some assets properly accounted for, some portions recognized as valid, some not. There was no victory lap in that. Only the cold relief of a not finally admitting it could not remain tied forever. When the mediator left us to sign, Adrena asked to speak to me alone. Rhea's eyes cut to mine immediately. "You don't have to," she said. I knew that. That was one of the few reliable pleasures of the past year, learning that "you don't have to" could exist as a complete sentence. Still, I nodded. We stepped into the hallway outside the conference room. The overhead lights were too bright, the carpet too thin, the whole building smelling faintly of toner and old rain trapped in coats. For a second, neither of us spoke. Up close, Audrina looked less like the sister who had floated through rooms and more like the woman Tessa Rowe had described. Good in the first half of things, not always prepared for what came after. Her lipstick had worn off at the center. There were faint crescents under her eyes. She seemed older than 34 and younger than consequence. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said. It was such a familiar kind of sentence. Not apology, not explanation, just distance from outcome. I looked at her. That's what people say when they like the beginning. Her mouth tightened. She glanced away, then back. Mom wanted me secure. Mom wanted a lot of things. She was scared. So was I. That seemed to land somewhere she had not planned for. Audrina crossed her arms, then uncrossed them again. You always make it sound like I took something that was yours. I thought about that. Not the legal answer, the human one. You took advantage of something that was already broken, I said. That's different. It's also not better. For a moment she looked as if she might finally say something true, something unarranged. But whatever it was passed across her face and disappeared. She would have hated all this, she said instead. I almost laughed. No, I said quietly. She was afraid of all this. That's not the same. I went back into the room before she could answer. The house sold in December. The sign appeared on the lawn the week after Thanksgiving, absurdly cheerful in red and white, as if what stood behind it were simply square footage and not the architecture of every hierarchy that had shaped my life. I did not go to the final walkthrough. I had already spent enough years being the one who stayed to shut windows, clear drawers, label boxes, and turn private damage into orderly transitions. I let the professionals do it. What I did do was review the final accounting, hospital invoices that had never fully been settled, home health balances, prescription overages, repairs to the furnace from the winter my mother refused to replace it until it gave out in a cold snap dramatic enough to offend her. The estate paid what it owed. That mattered to me more than I expected it to, not because I wanted my mother purified in retrospect, but because I needed the end of her life to stop living half on secrecy and half on my silent labor. The idea for the memorial grant came later, and smaller than people would probably imagine if they heard about it secondhand. There was no gala, no plaque on a wall. Just a conversation with the director of the Caldwell Community Resource Center, who was a practical woman with cropped blonde hair and tired eyes that brightened only when someone spoke about budgets honestly. Her name was Lena Fawcett, and she listened to my idea without sentimentalizing it. I don't want to start a foundation, I told her over a metal desk scarred by years of coffee cups and staplers. I don't want anything that requires a board and a logo and my face on a brochure. Lena nodded. Smart. I just want something modest. Emergency support for adults caring for elderly parents or relatives. Utility help. Respite hours. Grocery cards. Gas money for medical runs. The small things that keep people from quietly falling apart. Lena's expression changed. Not softer exactly, but more direct. How much modest are we talking? I named a number. Not enormous, not enough to make anyone clap, enough to matter to a handful of people at the exact wrong moment in their lives. That's workable, she said. More than workable. We set it up in my mother's name because that felt harder and truer than setting it up in mine, not as tribute in the flattering sense, as acknowledgement. Celeste Voss had created damage with the same instincts she once used to build a home. Both things could be true. I no longer needed one to cancel the other. By January, I had gone 3 full weeks without driving past Ashbury Lane. That was not healing. It was scheduling. Healing was quieter than I had expected. Less revelation, more attrition. The day I noticed my grocery cart no longer bent automatically toward my mother's favorite crackers. The first Tuesday night I stayed home instead of feeling a ghost obligation to check on someone. The fact that when the phone rang after 9 p.m., my body no longer assumed emergency. The strangest part was Audrina. She did leave town again, but not dramatically. No slammed doors, no social media monologue. Just a new forwarding address attached to paperwork and the gradual disappearance of her car from familiar places. She kept what the final settlement left her. I kept what it left me. There was no satisfying collapse, no public confession, no poetic punishment large enough to make the past line up neatly. That used to bother me. Then it began to feel like proof that I was finally living in the real world instead of auditioning for a revenge fantasy. In early February, a letter arrived, not from a lawyer, just a plain white envelope with a Denver postmark, and my name in handwriting I recognized immediately. Adrina's was rounder than our mother's, more careful, as if she had always believed legibility could stand in for sincerity. I almost threw it away unopened. Instead, I made tea, sat at my kitchen table, and slid it open with the same butter knife I had used on my mother's envelope months before. Inside was a single page, no dramatic opening, no tears pressed into paper. Just this: you were there for everything, and I built my return on that. I don't know if I understood how much until too late. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just don't want to keep pretending I didn't know. That was all. No defense, no mention of our mother, no request to meet, no fake spiritual growth dressed up as accountability. I read it twice. Then I folded it along the original crease and put it in the kitchen drawer beside the coupons, takeout menus, and the spare batteries I kept forgetting I already had. Not because it meant nothing, because it meant exactly enough. The first meeting of the caregiver support group funded by the grant happened the following Thursday evening in a multi-purpose room at the community center. Metal chairs, bad coffee, a tray of grocery store cookies no one touched until the last 10 minutes. 7 people showed up. A middle-aged man caring for his father after a stroke. A woman younger than me whose aunt had dementia and a talent for wandering. 2 sisters arguing softly over hospice paperwork. The room did not glow with inspiration. No one gave speeches. They just started talking about logistics first, bills, sleep, which pharmacies still delivered. Then gradually the harder things, the resentment nobody likes admitting, the way love can become administrative, the humiliation of being praised for selflessness by people who are very glad it's not their turn. I did not tell my whole story. I did not need to. When it was my turn, I said, my mother needed more from me than she ever knew how to name, and I spent a long time mistaking that for being valued. No one looked shocked. No one rushed to fix it. They just nodded in that grave, exhausted way people do when something is true enough to belong to all of them a little. That night, after I got home, I stood in my kitchen and looked at the 2 things hanging on the wall. One framed recipe card in my mother's hand, one small photo of her from years before the illness hollowed her out, sitting on the back porch in a sweater the color of old wine, hair slightly windblown, not smiling, not posing, just existing in a moment no one had polished for public use. I understood her better now. Not in a way that made her harmless, just fully. And maybe that was the only ending I had ever really been owed. Sometimes the deepest hurt does not come from strangers, but from being taken for granted by the people who always knew you would stay. If this story spoke to you, maybe let it remind you that love should never require you to disappear in order to be accepted. If you have ever been the one who gave more than anyone noticed, I hope you find peace, clarity, and the courage to choose yourself too. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story stayed with you, please subscribe and stay with us for more. Wishing you peace tonight.